Okay, if we could resume the hearing now. So moving on through the site specifics onto the DS02 site. This is Central Hindhead, London Road, Hindhead. Now, this is another one where I've got no further questions. We discussed in detail the mitigation position on that site. But Mr. Collins, I take it you have some concerns with the planning application relevant to that site at the minute.
Afternoon, so yes, of course, we'll stay clear of SPA matters now because it's all covered. Just to seek an update to inform the hearing really on the latest planning application, which is pending determination. Don't know if there's a committee date scheduled for it. It's an observation just in respect of A, deliverability, but B, just implications for the plans. On the deliverability side, the submitted viability report outlines that the scheme's running a deficit of nearly £1 million, 932,000 to be exact. And therefore, obviously, the applicant is proposing 100% market housing. So a couple of questions there. One is this site a better, more viable commercial proposition than residential? And the second is, if it does come forward for residential, then it won't be delivering any affordable housing, which we know is a key issue in Hazelmere and Hindhead, owing to a number of applications not providing affordable housing in the past. So those are our two main comments.
Any response on those points? I mean, noting that the latest table on anticipated rate of development anticipates this would be beyond the 5 years, it being the latter 5 years of the plan period.
Thank you, sir. In regard to the pending planning application, there's no further update from when we last provided a position. It's still pending, and there is not currently committee date set as far as I am aware. In terms of the delivery of the site, I think we've already said to you that the former garage on the site has been relocated. So in some senses, the site is ready for development. However, we have been realistic with our expectations. In regard to the affordability element that's been raised by Mr. Collins in regards to the pending application, I think that's a matter that's dealt with by the application itself, and we believe that housing development can be delivered on the site.
So what does the viability study in general say about this type of site in terms of housing affordability? Got any views on that?
So the viability report for local plan part 2, which is LPP2 CD2 19, I believe. I think the conclusions are set out in section 6.4, and basically it defined that that sites within Waverley would be viable. I don't think the viability was as strong as previous studies undertaken, but still deemed as being viable through the assessment of the work that they've done.
Okay, thank you. But the point is noted, Mr. Collins, that the viability work with the current planning application perhaps takes a more site-specific view in this case. So is there anything further on that site before we move on?
No, so it's a relatively minor point, just for context and consideration on affordable housing delivery. It might be also relevant for Thursday.
So moving on to DSO3, this is land at Andrews. So there's been a recent planning permission relevant to this site, and a main modification has been proposed. So could you talk us through the position on that, please?
So in relation to the Andrews site, LPP2 has always envisaged that a high dependency care home would be brought forward on the site, as this is the type of development that would be acceptable within the proximity to the SPA. On the 4th of April this year, a permission was granted for a 74-bed high dependency care home. And this was slightly greater than the number which was envisaged through, had been presented previously in the local plan part 2. And accordingly, using the formula set out in the housing delivery test we have, and the loss of existing dwellings on the site, we propose a modification to update the policy to reflect the granted planning permission, and therefore it should reflect that the allocation is for a 74-bed high dependency care home, equivalent of 39 net dwellings.
So we're going to return on Thursday to the rationale for the C2 counting towards general housing supply. So I don't intend to discuss that in more detail now, because I know others who aren't here have got views on that. It'd be useful to hear those in the round on the Thursday afternoon session. But just as a general point, Mr. Collins, you've got the view that sites with planning permission should be removed as allocations. Could you just run that past us, please?
Thank you, sir. I'll pass it on to my colleague who's attending on Thursday, really the formulaic approach for discussion. I suppose on this point, we've just taken the view that they obviously need to be accounted for somewhere, commitments. It's whether or not there's a purpose to have an allocation anymore. If it's got consent, then I suppose you could still have an allocation if it's not implemented yet, but at least once it's past the implementation stage, then that should probably rightly be accounted for in the commitments tab. I appreciate the council's updated its commitments data, which was published this morning or last night. So we're reviewing that as a team in a moment ahead of Thursday. So it's a minor point as that, but it might just need some main modification tidying up. I think the same principle would apply to the Heights site as well, which is DSO5, which has consent.
So in terms of that, I mean, I'd pose the MIQ question in some main modifications where allocations have been removed, and my view is until it's implemented, it perhaps remains relevant in terms of guiding development on the site. But in terms of that commitments and how things are counted between allocations and planning permissions, could you enlighten us on that, please?
Yes, so I think there's 4 sites that probably fall under this category in Hazelmere and Hindhead, and within your MIQs you raised whether keeping the policy would provide an effective approach for the site should alternative applications come forward, and we consider that that's a sensible suggestion, and we've proposed removal of the modifications that we previously proposed. So the 4 sites haven't yet been implemented, so we propose to retain those policies should an alternative scheme come forward. And in regard to the point about where these permissions are captured so that we avoid double counting, all of the sites that have gained planning permission or have a resolution to permit as of 1st April 2022 are captured within the outstanding permissions or resolutions to permit, so our commitments. And within LPP2, we state that we are delivering 265 additional dwellings, which takes away, it doesn't include those sites that are already counted under our commitments. So we've been very careful not to double count numbers.
Okay, I've got no further questions on DS05 in that regard. Is there anything anybody else wants to raise on that one? Okay. And so in terms of DS08, I think in terms of whether it's major development and those kinds of considerations, although it's at a lower yield than anticipated on DS06, I've got no further questions in relation to this site. I think I get the general thrust of where you're coming from in terms of the principles on those issues. In terms of Sang, again, we've discussed that in detail last week, so I've got nothing further at this juncture on that. But Mr. Collins, have you got anything particularly on DS08?
I think we'd risk repeating previous statements made, sir. You just highlighted you're aware of those other issues, which you can take as read. I mean, I think the application is still live for 18 units on the site. So any update to the examination on that might prove beneficial to you, sir. And anything from Natural England in respect of their position. But you might have already asked for that anyway last week, but that would probably be my only additional comment.
Mr. Wiseman?
Thank you, sir. Nothing to add really, and don't want to repeat ourselves, but it was well rehearsed this morning. Just to say that our site from a sustainability location is well related to the subway under the A3. That's a key point for our site. Our site, Mr. Banner would be very pleased that we can deliver quickly on the ground. The application is pending. We are just exploring a matter with Natural England, as you can imagine, but it's worth noting that when our application was submitted, it was submitted off the back of a smaller allocation for this site of 18 units, and the allocation was for 20. Natural England at that point correctly commented that it is sub 20 and therefore does not need to provide SAG. So our early application for the site is deliverable, achievable, and available. And we look forward to putting those units on the ground. And the other thing, just to separate ourselves from DS06, because I know it was mentioned that, is it 130 units? Well, ours is it's a very different site, different characteristics. We're not beholden to Sport England, and our client, Voyage Care, would retain a long-term interest in the site as part of their C2 offer. So we have a different offer. This is not a sort of sell it to a house builder and run. So nothing further to add. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Sargent.
So I apologise, but I've just been provoked into making a brief but obvious point, which is that although the application is for 18 and therefore under the threshold of 20, whereby we get into sort of SANG mitigation territory, the allocation is for 40. So everything that I said this morning about our skepticism around the ability of the site to, offer acceptable mitigation, and the fact that that hasn't been done to the requisite evidential standard as we sit here today applies equally in relation to this allocation as it does to DS06. Thank you.
Mr. Beglan, any responses on those points?
So I think by this stage, this is a well-travelled ground. Unless it's going to assist you, I don't think we had anything further to say on that point.
So in terms of moving on to the National Trust car park, so I think things have moved on really since the MIQs, because the OMB board has expressed no concerns in relation to the proposal for the reason that it gives in its hearing statement. And similarly, no objections to the allocation have been made in principle from Natural England, and that's set out in the statement of common ground. So any initial views on that from your perspective, Mr. Beglan?
So no, it just goes to show, as it were, the statutory consultee is on board, as well as the trust. And in those circumstances, there's no reason to think that the land can't come forward in the way that we've suggested within our hearing statement.
And could you outline the view on whether a safe and suitable access could be facilitated? So this relates to previous and existing uses of the site and the potential traffic implications of those.
Thank you, sir. So as outlined in our response to your MOQs, the site's previous use was as a training and conference facility. And in 2011, planning permission was granted to change that use to a C2 residential institution. And as part of that application, traffic assessments were undertaken. And the Highway Authority commented at this point in time that the former use generated greater vehicular movements than would be predicted by the proposed use of C2. Given that the previous use was acceptable in planning terms and had been assessed through the planning system, there was a clear surplus of traffic movements that could be utilised through this residential proposal. It's also worth noting that Surrey County Council have been consulted at all stages as the Highway Authority on all allocations, and they've raised no concerns about residential development on this site. And it should be noted that it is a relatively modest yield, and therefore the amount of traffic movements that we'd expect to be generated is limited and could be accommodated given the former use and traffic movements that were previously acceptable on this site.
So is it still in use as a car park for National Trust?
So that the car park is owned by the National Trust and leased to the C2 residential use. As far as we're aware, it is still used by them, but not to full capacity. Hence, the National Trust looking to redevelop this and utilise it for a different use.
Ms. Tipper.
Thank you, sir. I won't go over previous ground that we mentioned this morning about the isolated position. I think we've made ourselves very clear in that regard. I do just want to pick up on this point about highways movements. There seems to be quite an emphasis in terms of vehicle movements and comparing that to the previous approved C2 use, which would draw very different modes of transport than typical C3 use. And in that regard, there doesn't seem to have been the necessary or degree of scrutiny as to the potential impacts arising from pedestrian use, not necessarily just vehicle use. The site is isolated, like I said, and wouldn't lend itself towards accessing it via foot, particularly in winter months, without the necessary lighting that one would expect. And in that regard, I don't think it necessarily performs as well as other sites, such as those within that Hawesmere South area as Den Farm.
Thank you, Ms. Tipper. So in terms of, so I've got your case in terms of the vehicular movements, but in terms of pedestrian movements and other modes of transport, cycling potentially, how does that site perform?
Thank you, sir. So in regard to the SA assessment of this site, it has recognised in objective 14 that the site is relatively distant from the town and sustainable transport links. However, we have no concern that the access in and out of the site is suitable for different forms of transport, and improvements could be made if it was deemed that that would improve that access for cyclists, pedestrians, and other users. And then once you get down to the bottom of the site, you are on the main road into Way Hill. So although it is more distant than some of the other sites we've discussed today, we don't think it's unsustainable.
Ms Tifford, did you want to come back in?
Only insofar as to emphasise that the realistic probability of pedestrians in particular utilising an unlit, unfootpathed site to access facilities is just improbable.
Thank you. So moving on now to DS 10. So again, I've got no further questions on that site. Is there anything anybody else would like to raise on that one? Similarly on DS 11.
It's a small query in the scheme of things, so I suspect, but again, this is a site which is now, I think, still proposed for 5 dwellings, whereas the planning inspector back in February took the view it should only be a single dwelling. So we're not clear on what basis the council's changed its mind, or not changed its mind, but is resisting the planning inspector's conclusions on that point.
So this is what I understand is 2 extant planning permissions relevant to the site. So the question is why one yield's been preferred to the other, I suppose.
So when the site was discussed at the planning appeal, it's my understanding that the owner at that point in time was suggesting that the larger yield scheme was not their preference, and they were planning to build out the 1 unit scheme. And I think they may have cited their own viability issues. However, no information was presented against that. Since then, we have seen the site is for sale, and in the sale information, both schemes are noted, and we've got no evidence before us to suggest that the 5 unit scheme is not implementable, and it's been assessed as suitable through the proof of the grant of planning application.
Ms Sargent.
So just to observe that it is correct that the inspector back in February noted that viability issues have been raised, and it doesn't sound to me as though actually the council has seen any evidence to suggest that there aren't viability issues in relation to that site. The inspector's conclusion in February was that there was clear evidence that the 5 unit scheme wouldn't deliver, and I don't understand the council to be saying that they have had positive evidence to counter that and to show that it will.
thank you. Anything just finally on that particular site?
Sir, I wasn't at the planning inquiry, but if the owner was giving information at that stage, said that a 1-unit scheme was preferred, then it's not surprising, bearing in mind we're talking about between 1 to 5 units, that within the planning appeal as a whole, it'd be surprising if a great deal of time was spent on that. You've heard Mrs. Nash's evidence about what's happened since, and we know what the usual rule is in relation to sites that have the benefit of extant planning permission.
Okay, I've got no further questions on the sites, site allocations at this juncture. Are there any further points before we wrap up for today?
Sorry, sir, I was just checking, but no further points. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you all for your contributions this morning and this afternoon. So this hearing session is concluded. We'll pick up tomorrow morning in terms of substantive matters at 9:30 with matter 9. We'll take a short break till about 25 to, and then come back to do our regular sort of action points and housekeeping session. So thank you all again for your contributions. Okay, well, I don't know whether to make this brief or keep everyone in this cool room now, but so we've had a communication from Mr. Good.
Yes.
Yeah, he was unable to make the reconvene session on Thursday afternoon. He asked whether he could make a brief written response to the material that's been uploaded recently. I'm minded to accept that, given that it's only one participant. Any views on that, Mr. Begman?
So no, if we're treating it as an exception that's got a plainly justifiable reason behind it, then we don't object in principle. But obviously, if the material can be provided in advance of the Thursday session, then we can respond to it then. And if there are any delays or difficulties, then I'm sure we can work out a procedure that allows us a time to respond.
Yeah, Mr. Good indicated he could get it to us tomorrow.
Yeah.
Oh, that'd be very helpful.
Thanks. And as far as we know, everyone else is coming back, aren't they, to either virtually or in person to that session?
Yes. No.
Okay, so in terms of the actions today, so the first one I've picked up is the Dartford case. I wonder whether it also be useful to have Matthew and Campbell uploaded as well, please.
So on that, it may be the second item you're coming to, but in response to that, I pointed to the more general discussion in the Planning Law Encyclopedia at P5554, and if that would help you just as a matter of background to have that in, we can reproduce that part of the Planning Law Encyclopedia.
Yes, please, that would be useful.
So that's right. I'll be assisted by Miss Knowles if I miss anything out. She's been assiduously keeping the list. But there was a suggestion from you that we gratefully adopted about the prospect of inquiring into a statement of common ground in relation to DSO1, and related to that, whether or not there is further work in the background that we can share with the examination relating to the ultimate way in which that site might come forward. So I think that's all I had on my list. I'll just turn around and check with Ms. Knoll.
I think also you asked whether there was anything in relation to DSO7 and the car parking that we might be able to provide. So we said we would have a look at that as well.
Yeah, and Ms. Smith indicated that there might be something in relation to that that could be provided, yeah. But Mrs. Nash.
So there was just one point that we briefly discussed, but I don't know if we agreed on whether a modification was necessary, and that was in relation to the rural school allocation in Part A, where we referred to the successful relocation of the school, and we suggested whether it might be a good idea to add a bit more detail in relation to the sport facilities. And I don't know whether that was something you wanted us to make or to be thought about.
I was going to reflect on that, I think, in terms of what you've said in the hearing statement and what I've heard this morning, and revisit it. So if I'd handle that in post hearings correspondence if I consider it to be necessary. So I think that's everything, is it, for today?
So I think it is.
Thank you again for your contributions today. And as I say, we'll reconvene tomorrow at 9:30. So have a good evening.